Charles Fraser. The Turin Shroud. The Sherlock Holmes Easter Special, Episode 5. Based on the characters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A goaudio production. "What did he do?" burst out our young vicar. "He got what he deserved in the end," Gina exclaimed indignantly. Holmes and I were reduced to mere spectators during this spectacle unfolding before us. "No, I don't believe it. Can it be? You killed him?" said our vicar, horrified. "Do you believe that? Do you really believe that?" Gina asked again. Pastor Milani, who had previously jumped up from his chair in agitation, slumped back into it and buried his face in his hands. Gina slowly approached Holmes and me and handed Holmes a small book. It was a diary. Her diary. Written there in an ornate, girlish handwriting. It was such a sunny, wonderful day today. I wore my favourite skirt, the pink one with all the frills along the hem. Father gave me a basket containing a cake and a bottle of wine. For a moment, I felt like Little Red Riding Hood from the fairy tale I so loved to read. I had to giggle. Father sent me over to the cathedral with it. I was supposed to give it to Pastor Spina. Somehow that man frightens me. He touches me so often. I don't like it. I always feel like the pastor wants to be very close to me. But Father had ordered me to go, and I obeyed. I found the pastor praying in a pew. When he saw me, he lifted his head and looked at me very strangely. Then he wanted me to sit with him in the pew. At first, I didn't want to, but he told me he would pray with me. I couldn't say no to that. Immediately, he placed his sweaty hand on my bare thigh. I felt terribly uncomfortable and slid along the pew, a bit away from him. But the pastor slid after me, and if I had moved even a tiny bit further, I would have fallen out of the pew. And that wouldn't have been proper. Immediately, Pastor Spina put his hand on my thigh again, though this time a bit higher. He began to stroke me, and I froze. Then his hand went even higher, and he was almost at my knickers. He reached into my knickers and suddenly started breathing very oddly. I had no idea what was happening to me. Then he lifted me up and forced me into the confessional. I don't want to write about what happened next, but it was awful. Very awful. I despise all men, except my father and my brother. They would surely never do that. Holmes turned the page and a new entry began. I told Father everything today. He slapped me across the face. It still hurts now. He said I was a deceitful little thing. He didn't believe me. I will never forgive him for this. Holmes looked up and said, "I don't think I need to read any further." Gina shook her head and replied, "No, you don't need to. Everything you need to know about Spina and my father is said in the first 2 pages. "So you murdered the pastor," said Holmes. "If that is the prevailing opinion of you and my brother, then I suppose it must be so. I can understand you, really, and I'm completely on your side, Signora Milani. But the police are already involved in this murder case. I can't simply let you go, even though I would very much like to do so." "It no longer matters," she said quietly. "But it is," Holmes insisted, "and I promise you I shall do everything in my power to secure your release as quickly as possible." "Don't go to any trouble," she replied. "Brother, just promise me one thing. Look after my children in the home. Swallow your pride and make peace with Father. The children need the money. Whatever will become of them otherwise." Pastor Milani remained silently seated in his chair, concealing his face. Holmes looked at the pastor and offered him the opportunity to say a few words to his sister, but he did not respond. So Holmes finally said, with a deep sigh in his voice, "Come, Signora, we'll take you to the police." Holmes and I sat together in my room at the boarding house. We were both dejected by the events that had just unfolded at the Milanis' villa. "I have a very bad feeling about this. I believe we have made a mistake," said Holmes, standing up and pacing agitatedly around the room. "What mistake? You think Signora Milani is innocent? But everything fits together perfectly. True, she hasn't explicitly confessed, but even if she doesn't do so in court, the evidence against her will convict her." "That's precisely what worries me," replied Holmes. Holmes, listen. Gina had free access to the key. That means she could unlock the chapel at any time. She had the burial cloth that covered Spina's nakedness. Besides, she could have killed Spina far more brutally by actually driving the nails through his hands and feet. But she didn't, because deep down she's still a good person. Admit it, Holmes. It all fits perfectly. The girl is guilty, even if you don't want to believe it. Holmes sighed deeply and sat back down in his chair. But his thoughts continued to race, and I wanted to distract him. So I had the idea to ask him further about what exactly had happened to Jesus on this Easter Monday. I knew he couldn't possibly resist teaching me. Holmes, you haven't shared your impressive knowledge with me until the very end, I said as casually as possible. What do you mean by that? Well, what happened next with Jesus on Easter Monday? I said simply, feeling quite pleased with myself. This story is quickly coming to an end. Jesus appeared to 2 wandering disciples who immediately set off back to Jerusalem to bring the joyous news of Jesus' resurrection to the other disciples. The end. But suddenly he jumped up. I've had an idea. Come along, Watson. Make haste. Where on earth are we rushing off to so suddenly? I asked, irritated. To the cathedral, to the Shroud chapel, Holmes called out excitedly. You've given me an idea. Me? What did I make you think of? If the murderer of Pastor Spina stages such a performance on Good Friday and risks being caught, perhaps even during the preparations, then the same murderer might return to the crime scene on Easter Monday to proclaim, metaphorically speaking, his resurrection. Holmes mused. Or perhaps the murderer is already quite rightly sitting behind bars, I added pointedly. Do you want to come along or not? I had to make a decision. Holmes had already gone out the door. A short while later, Holmes and I sat hidden behind the door of the Shroud Chapel. We had previously borrowed the key from Cardinal Fossati and solemnly promised him that this time we would lock ourselves in rather than him. Holmes waited intently for a sound from outside, whilst I, admittedly, was rather bored. The hours passed and nothing happened. If one were to add up all the hours we had spent lying in wait over the past few days. I didn't finish the thought. No, I was in an unusually irritable mood. This pointless waiting seemed as dreary and futile as nothing else had done before. Then suddenly I thought of my dear sausages, who would be waiting sadly and alone for me in the boarding house room. And then I made a decision. I would put an end to all of this. Right here and now, I would break free from Holmes and his completely twisted ideas and claims and… What was that? Holmes had heard it too. He put his index finger to his lips and signalled me to be quiet, as if I didn't know that myself. Another sound. Someone was trying to insert a key into the lock. I listened, transfixed. This someone had just managed it. I both heard and felt how the key turned and the bolt sprang back. The door was open. The doorknob was being pressed down slowly, ever so carefully. Light fell through a narrow gap into the interior of the chapel. The beam of light grew steadily wider until suddenly a shadow fell across it. The shadow of a person. Blast it! Holmes was right again. Holmes and I made ourselves small, trying to become invisible, and were quiet as mice. The person entered. The door fell back into its lock, and Holmes and I were now completely exposed, sitting by the wall next to the door. Holmes quickly darted the short distance to the door and locked it from the inside. The person turned around startled. I lit the lamp we had brought, and there I saw her. Or rather, him. "Camilla!" Holmes and I exclaimed in unison. Slowly, all 3 of us seemed to overcome the shock of our reunion. "The lady from the train, then," Holmes stated dryly. "My 2 heroes from the train in Paris. Actually, I thought if we were to meet again, it would be under more pleasant circumstances." "CSP," Holmes recalled. I looked at him with complete incomprehension. "The initials on the stolen purse, CSP Camilla Spina. You are the daughter, or rather the son, of Reverend Spina. Am I correct?" Holmes deduced. "You're right, just like back then on the train," she said bitterly. "Would you like to get it off your chest?" Holmes asked sympathetically. She nodded briefly. We sat together in a circle in front of the altar. I placed our lamp directly in the middle. The light illuminated our faces atmospherically. I was born as Carl Spina. Camilla began her story. I lived alone with my mother. The neighbourhood children taunted me as a bastard. No, life was never easy for us. My mother and Pastor Spina, only came to visit occasionally and always late in the evening. After all, appearances and his good reputation as a pastor had to be maintained. My mother felt no love for him. How could she have? He constantly humiliated her whenever he was around, and if she didn't do exactly as she was told immediately, she would feel his belt. I was treated no differently. His wife and his brat had to be disciplined when they didn't obey. He always justified this by referring to the Bible, which he carried with him constantly. I entered puberty and felt uncomfortable in my body. I had never really felt comfortable, as far back as I could remember, but from then on it became increasingly unbearable for me. I began growing my hair out and secretly tried on my mother's skirts. When my father caught me one day, he fell to his knees in shock and started praying first. Only afterwards did he take out his belt and beat me as if there was no tomorrow, and the most cruel thing about it was that he visibly enjoyed it. From then on, he only called me the one possessed by the devil. I was his child, and I had never done anything forbidden in my life or caused anyone harm. When my mother died, he cut off all further contact with me. I fought for survival. To society, I was an orphan, had nothing to eat and no one who loved me. But I am strong. I managed. I turned my back on Turin and built a new life in Manchester, England. But I never became happy. I had work, a roof over my head, and 2 friends who caught me when I was down. But my life was ruined and forever marked. Not because I was born in the wrong body. No one can help that. Neither my father, nor my mother, and least of all myself. It just is what it is. A quirk of nature. Just like how one happens to have black or red or blonde hair. But I blame my father for turning me into this miserable wretch. Years after I had established myself in Manchester, I wrote my father a letter. I told him how I was doing, wanted to meet him and probably also finally find peace. I signed my letter as Camilla Spina. I promptly received a reply. In short, it said that I, as the devil's bride come true, should throw myself off the nearest bridge and not tarnish his good reputation and standing in the church community with my existence. Camilla paused briefly. Then she continued quietly. I cannot even list all the cruel things he did to me in the name of the church and the Holy Bible. A short while ago, I unexpectedly received another letter from him. He informed me that he would soon die. He was apparently gravely ill. Holmes let out an inappropriately loud laugh. I hardly dare say it, but your father merely had a mild case of the flu. He was back on his feet after a few days. Women would probably call it a case of man flu. Camilla smiled, but immediately became serious again and continued. He explicitly asked me not to attend his funeral. He deeply regretted my existence, and the long time I would spend burning in hell after my death would surely drive out my depravity. I was completely shocked and couldn't comprehend it, so I promptly decided to do exactly what would enrage him the most. I wanted to attend his funeral, both for his sake and equally for my own. You can surely imagine how surprised I was when I encountered him in the pink of health. So I had devised a plan that involved his death. Specifically, I wanted to humiliate him in front of everyone. I asked him on Good Friday to have a conversation with me. The Shroud Chapel seemed to be the appropriate location. I wanted his entire damned congregation to see him during the Easter Shroud viewing. I knocked him down, stole his key and dragged him inside. I stripped him completely naked, tied him to his cursed cross and simply stabbed him with a knife. I must confess, I felt nothing whilst doing it. At that very moment, the door was unlocked from the outside, and a young woman entered with a cloth in her bag. She looked at him and began to cry. But not out of pity and horror, as I initially thought. No, She wept with relief, and then told me her story. She took the cloth and covered his nakedness. She couldn't bear the sight, she said then. She hugged me, wished me well, and disappeared, never to be seen again. Not for a second did I fear she might betray me. We were sisters in spirit. Silence reigned. Neither Holmes nor I dared to speak a word. It was Camilla herself who broke the silence. Please hand me over to the police now. I learned at noon today that they had arrested a young woman for the murder of the pastor. I assume it's the same woman who gave me the cloth. I nodded. I just wanted to return here one last time and bid farewell to my old life. Then I intended to turn myself in to the police and clear that poor girl's name. I will no longer be free, but my mind and soul will be, and that made it worth it. Holmes and I rose together with Camilla. She linked arms with us on both sides, and we accompanied her to the police station. I could hardly imagine how the officer on duty would react when, just hours later, we would hand over a new murderess in the same case. 3 weeks later, Holmes received a parcel from Turin with an accompanying letter. The sender was listed as a certain Gina Milani. To dear Mr. Holmes and the treacherous Dr. Watson, I am free, and I have only you to thank for that, Mr. Holmes. Yes, for the first time in years, I truly feel like a free person again, and until now only one other person has been able to share this feeling with me. That is why the news hit me hard when Camilla Spina took her own life in her cell. My father passed away shortly after her. Unfortunately, I was unable to reconcile with him, but I can live with that. My brother has now become the sole heir after all, and has bequeathed his entire fortune to me. I shall forever be in his debt, but this helps my many children immensely, and I know they are well provided for. My brother believes that, as a devout man of the church, he has no need for money. Genoveva and my brother love each other as they always have, and I sincerely hope their triangular relationship with God endures this love. Since my father's death, Genoveva has moved in with us, officially as a maid. This makes everything considerably easier for all involved. Mr. Holmes, I often think of you. That is why I have enclosed a small present with these lines. With eternal gratitude, Gina Milani. P.S. The Venerable Cardinal has of course received one as well. Do open the package at last, I urged Holmes curiously. Very slowly, he first untied the parcel string. Then he carefully cut through the sticky tape with a knife to finally open it at last. Holmes burst out laughing. Meanwhile, my anticipation got stuck in my throat. A white linen cloth, a good 4 meters long and at least 1 meter wide, emerged. The image of Jesus adorned both the front and back. You were listening to Charles Fraser, The Turin Shroud, the Sherlock Holmes Easter Special, Episode 5, based on the characters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A goaudio production.